Okay, I want to welcome everybody to the latest episode of my series, The Strange and Unexplained Phenomena of the South Mountains of North Carolina. I am your host, Kaiser Rebel, and this is episode 6, part 2, and it is titled Sudden Terror. I'm going to share with you the experience of two men who dealt with something on a cold November night that changed their outlook on a number of things. But before I get to that point, just let me send out a heartfelt thank you to all of you that supported me this year, for all that you've done for me, watched my stuff and commented on it and shared it and reposted it. Thank you all so very, very much. And I want to wish everybody Merry Christmas, and I hope you have a Happy New Year. Tonight's episode involves, like last week, a uncle and nephew duo. And I'm not using the real names here, but we'll start off with Uncle Jeff. Uncle Jeff lives in this area here, south of the South Mountains mountain chain, just a few miles from the southern border of the state park. And a country boy, outdoorsman, hunter, fisher, camper, hiker, that kind of thing. And then his nephew Jake, who lives about an hour east of here. Now, there was a certain period of time that young Jake would travel up here on Thursdays to spend time with his uncle. And on those Thursdays, they would attend a local bluegrass church, which is a regular church. They just do bluegrass music. They don't have a piano. They got a banjo. They got a guitar, a doghouse bass, a mandolin, a fiddle, a dobro. But Jeff and his nephew Jake had that in common. They were both bluegrass musicians. Jeff's a bluegrass vocalist. They were both heavily into bluegrass. So they had that link, and they had a really good relationship for an uncle and a nephew. And then after each service, Jake would follow his uncle home and then stay another couple hours, sometimes on up into the night, just hanging around, maybe picking, cutting up, talking, that kind of thing. But on one particular cold November night in 2018, things happened as I described. They went to the service. Jake followed his uncle back to the house, and they spent some time together. And a little after 11 o'clock, Jake said, "I'm going to have to go." Uncle Jeff walked him to the door, and they said their goodbyes, and Jeff started the process of getting ready for bed. He went to plug his phone up to charge it, and it rang. It was his nephew, who in a very frightened and anxious voice simply said, "I need you to get out here right now." And he hung up. Jeff had fortunately not shed his boots yet. He grabbed a coat and he got outside, not having a clue what to expect. And he found his nephew to simply be standing over in the yard, which is on high ground. And he walked up to him and said, "What's going on?" And his nephew said, "Shh." And he pointed across the way and he said, "Listen, something is over there." And sure enough, in a few seconds, Jeff heard the distinct sound of something walking in those woods across the way from them. Now, they were on high ground, and then that went down to a little country road that's a dead-end road, and then a fence, and then about 10 yards past that fence was the wood line. And this wood line was the starting area of a holler, or what in other parts of the country you might call it a draw or a valley. But it was the starting point of a hollow that was very deep and run all the way to a major creek here in northern Cleveland County called Ward's Creek. So they listened, and they kept hearing the sound of something moving, and it was clear to Jeff that it was something walking on 2 feet. He made the mental note at the time that it was heavy-footed, that it seemed to be walking slow and deliberately, and all the while getting closer and closer and closer to them. And he told Jake, he said, I've got to run inside and get my spotlight. And he left Jake there for just a couple of minutes, and he ran in, found his spotlight, came back outside, and the sound of the footfalls continued. And he began to spotlight those woods. Now, keep in mind, though this is November when this happened and the leaves were off the trees, it's still so thick in some of these parts of these woods with the big trees, medium trees, saplings, the undergrowth. You can't see far into them at night, even with the flashlight. So he just continued to scan with the spotlight, trying to hone in on the source of the sound. It had stopped getting closer, but it had not stopped. It sounded as though it was pacing back and forth, just inside the wood line. And as he spotlighted, he stopped because he thought he saw movement. And he concentrated and he focused and was trying to figure out what, if anything, he was looking at. And then, without warning, there was this angry sounding, guttural, low-based yell or shout, followed by what was described as an ape-like sound. And I can, rather than describe it, I'll just try to mimic it the way that they mimicked it to me. And it sounded something like this. Oh. They stopped. He didn't see anything. He didn't see any movement. Now, we all face points in life when we have the fight or flight reaction. And young Jake had the flight reaction. And he broke out and ran toward the house. Now, Jeff, being an old country boy, he knows if you're out in the woods or in some situation like that, and your buddy runs, the best thing to do is follow him and ask questions later, and that's what he did. So they got into the house, and they were talking to each other. What was that? Now, they were both well aware of the lore. Jeff had actually had some experiences in the past, and curiosity got the best of them. If you have an experience, that curiosity bug is going to bite you. Trust me. It will change things, and that curiosity bug will get you. They elected to come back outside. Jake said, let me grab my piece out of my vehicle. He grabbed a handgun, so at that point in time, they did have some protection. And Jeff resumed spotlighting, and they could hear this, the source of this continuing to walk, pacing back and forth, and it stopped. And after a few minutes, they decided to go downhill, cross that road, and go to that fence, and they still had the relative safety of about 10 yards of clear area between that fence and the woods. And they got down to the fence. The walking resumed, except now it was walking away from them, and it was clear to them that it was descending back down into the depths of that holler. And it continued to get more distant, but then they could tell that it was not moving away from them anymore, and it was pacing back and forth and back and forth. They would hear some more of the sounds, and then it all stopped. Jeff and Jake, after a few minutes, decided to go back up into the yard on high ground, and they did so. And they heard the steps coming back up out of the holler toward them, closer and closer and closer. And they knew at that point that it was as close as it had been yet. Jeff was faithfully spotlighting those woods, trying to hone in to see anything that he could see, and finally it happened. He testifies that he clearly saw a mouth and an upper chest, and that the only thing that wasn't covered by hair was the mouth. And to the best of his knowledge, it was a reddish brown colored hair, and he was mesmerized by it, and caught up in the moment again and looking. And suddenly the shout, these guttural yells started again with those ape-like noises, and they clearly heard stomping, and the yelling and the stomping, and then he saw with the spotlight that one of the trees was shaking violently back and forth, and they felt relatively safe. They had protection. They had a lot of distance, but both were very uneasy and both were very frightened. And that continued for several minutes. And then finally it stopped. They heard the footsteps. They heard the footsteps getting more distant and more distant and more distant, until finally they didn't hear them anymore. So they were just standing there wondering what just happened. Whatever this was, what was it doing? Was it toying with them? Was it sending out a clear message? This is my area, you need to leave. But to this day, both men are deeply affected. As a matter of fact, that night, Jake said, I'm not sure if I want to drive out of here. Is a rock going to come out of the woods? Is something going to step out in the road? And Uncle said, well, I'll provide overwatch with the spotlight. And Jake was able to safely leave. But to this day, they are both deeply affected by that. And so would you. You guys take care. I'll see you next time.